This is my Mark 1 Volkswagen Caddy, which we've put a 3.2 litre engine in that we got from a crash damaged Audi TT. But today, I'm gonna drive it.
In the previous episode, we attempted to start the engine. We installed all the last bits that were needed, like fixing the issue with the oil cooler, getting the radiator installed, and figuring out the coolant system. We also resprayed and installed the intake manifold, and then attempted to first start. However, despite our efforts, the engine refused to start, and now we're left with this.
In the last episode, we managed to get the engine to turn over, but we just couldn't get it started. I think I found the issue of why it's not starting, but we'll come on to that later on in the episode. All of the main things are already connected to the engine, but there's still a few things that we need to do before we can attempt to drive it. I think the first point of attack is getting this sensor fitted. When I'm driving the car, I need to know what temperature the engine is sitting at. There's a gauge on the instrument cluster that will tell me, but as the engine's been changed, the original sensors won't work.
Let's take a moment to talk about temperature sensors. These little devices play a crucial role in keeping an eye on the heat levels in our coolant system. Essentially, they measure the temperature of the coolant and send that signal to the dashboard. Why is it important? Well, it allows us to keep a close eye on our engine's temperature. If things start to heat up too much, the dashboard will alert us, usually by flashing red. This warning lets us know if our engine is overheating, giving us the chance to address the issue before it becomes a bigger problem. So the next time you see that little red light flashing, you'll know just how important those temperature sensors really are.
So I bought this temperature sensor from a Mark II Golf. Hopefully it actually works and sends the correct signal to the Mark 1 cluster.
To get the new sensor installed, the first step is removing the bracket holding the wiring loom. Once that's off, we can access the free slot in the thermostat by prying off the clip. With all of my fresh coolant leaking out, I remove the bung and then grease up the O-ring for the new sensor and push it into place. Now I can carefully push the coolant sensor down into its slot. There isn't a lot of room, so it's a good job I have small hands. Once it was seated correctly, I reinstalled the clip and got it plugged in.
So that's the sensor all installed now. We'll be able to test it once we can run the engine up to temperature. The next thing that we need to sort out is the accelerator pedal. In the Audi TT and the Mark V Golf, this is the accelerator pedal that is used. It mounts to the floor like this, but as you can see in the Caddy, that won't work. So after a lot of research, I found that you can use the Golf Mark 7 accelerator pedal, so I went and bought one from eBay. Unfortunately, there's no off-the-shelf mounting kits to mount this pedal into the Caddy, so I had to come up with something.
The pedal I'm using comes from a Mark 7 Golf. Conveniently, it uses the same plug as the Audi TT pedal. To mount it into the Caddy, I'm using the retrofittation pedal mount. I've used this mount before with the PD engine, so if you want a detailed guide on how to fit it, check out that video. While the mount is made for 1.8 turbo and PD swaps, I came up with a solution by adding a bracket to the top and creating a few extra holes to securely hold the Mark 7 pedal. Before mounting it into the car, I start by bolting the pedal to the mount. Next, I slide on the bracket I made to the top of the pedal and tighten it up. It's kind of funny because the bracket is actually some scrap that I kept from the Audi TT, originally used to hold the dashboard into place. Once that's all done, it's ready to go into the Caddy. Since I already have the mounting holes drilled, it's just a matter of lining the bracket up and securing the bolts. Finally, I can plug the pedal in. The next step in preparing the car for driving is installing the shifter. Since it's the same shifter from the PD swap, the bracket's already in place. I lift it up from underneath and then bolt it up securely. Before attaching the cables, it's a good idea to install the slave cylinder, since space will be limited once the cables are in. With that done, I feed the cables into the bracket and prepare the shifter to be aligned. Using a pin in the shifter and locking the gearbox side into neutral by flicking the black lever on the side of it and ensure everything is properly positioned. Once aligned, I attach the cables to the gearbox by releasing the spring. The next task is connecting up the steering rack. I wish I had done this earlier because there was literally no room to see what I was doing. First, I positioned it onto the steering rack and tightened up the bolts securely. Then I reinstalled the rubber boot. These rubber boots are no longer available, so I had to get creative and use a left-hand drive boot. Cut it and then carefully glue it back together to make it fit. Sometimes you have to improvise to make things work. Then I could connect it up inside of the car to the steering column and get the bolt tightened. Now, onto the part that everyone has been waiting for, the issue with the wiring that's been preventing the engine from starting. But before we dive into that, I have some exciting news to share. It's something that's been in the works behind the scenes, and let me tell you, it's a game changer.
I've got some exciting news to share. We've teamed up with Heritage Parts Centre, your go-to place for classic VW and Porsche parts. They've generously given you guys a special 10% discount code. So whether you're restoring a classic VW or fixing up your daily driver, Heritage Parts Centre has you covered. So at the checkout, use code ZAX, GAR10 for 10% off your order. Now, let's get back to what everyone has been waiting for. So after checking over all of the wires and a lot of sleepless nights, I've been speaking with a couple people that are way more experienced in the engine swaps than me, and we figured out that there's one wire missing from the ECU plug. In the last episode, a lot of people commented that the ECU hasn't been de-immobilized and that was why the engine wasn't starting, but it has. So hopefully that isn't the issue. So let me get that wire connected up and then we can see if the engine will start.
The first task was to solder on a wire and get it connected up. Once that was done, I applied some heat shrink to protect it and then taped up the entire loom. While I worked through resolving the issues of the engine not starting, I want to take a moment to give a huge thank you to everyone who commented on the last video with suggestions on why the engine wouldn't start. Sometimes when we're faced with problems, it can feel overwhelming, but it's important to remember that giving up is never the solution. Taking a step back, taking a break, and coming back with a fresh perspective can often make all the difference. And that's the beauty of having a car community, to share knowledge and experiences. By sharing what we've learned, we're not only helping ourselves, but countless others who may be encountering similar issues. This is precisely why I created my YouTube channel, to encourage a community of support and learning, where we can all grow together. With the loom all taped up, I could then plug everything in. I went through everything, triple checking to ensure that each plug was in the right place. And then finally, plugging in the ECU.
So I've got that wire in now and let's hope it actually fixes the issue. For good luck, let's put this cover on. It might make the engine start. So now we've got that luck, let's just give it a go. I'm a little bit nervous this time because if it doesn't start, then I really don't know what the issue could be. Let's just try it. Oh, the fuel pump is coming on, which is a really good sign. Let's just try it.
Can't help but feel an overwhelming sense of joy. Finally getting the engine started is a moment I'll never forget, and doing it alongside my dad makes it even more special. You know, when I first thought about putting this engine in, I was scared. I thought it was way out of my skill level. But here we are, proving that with determination, perseverance, and a little help from people, we can achieve anything. So to anyone out there feeling intimidated by a project or thinks it's beyond their abilities, don't let fear hold you back. Trust in your ability to learn and grow. You might be surprised with yourself and what you can accomplish.
I'm actually so relieved it starts and it sounds so smooth. But now it starts, it needs to stop, which brings us on to the next step. The brakes. I decided to go for Wilwood 4-pot calipers and I've upgraded the front servo to a 9-inch from a Mark II Golf. These should be enough to stop that beast of a 3.2. So let's get them put on.
The first step is to remove the front wheel, followed by unbolting the original caliper and removing it alongside the old disc. After applying some copper grease to the wheel hub, I installed the new disc, ensuring not to over-tighten the screw holding it in place. Now on to installing the massive brake calipers. The first step is to bolt on the adapter bracket, followed by threading on the fitting for the brake fluid onto the caliper. Next, 2 spaces are added and then I tighten down the caliper to the bracket. It's strange, I've never had a caliper like this before, making it surprisingly easy to insert the brake pads with just one piece of metal to slide off. With a small amount of ceramic brake caliper grease on the back of the pads, I slide them in and reinstall the retaining clip. Then it's time to install the braided lines, which I'll talk more about later in this episode. As the new brakes are larger, I temporarily install a new set of wheels and torque them down. Next, I repeat the entire process for the passenger side. Now, you might be wondering why upgrading the front brakes is necessary when upgrading the engine in the car. Well, it all comes down to performance and safety. A more powerful engine means increased speed and acceleration, which in turn requires more effective brake power to safely control the vehicle. The next components to go in are the 9-inch brake servo and the 22mm master cylinder, which should provide enough fluid to handle those big wheelwood brakes. Once those are in place, I install the brake linkages and connect the pedal.
So now we've got the servo and the master cylinder installed, we need to get the brake lines in. I was thinking to make some custom copper lines, but to save the headache, I thought I'd go with some braided hoses instead.
I opted for braided brake lines instead. This choice will save me a significant amount of time compared to bending copper lines and flaring the ends. The braided hoses come pre-made with the correct fittings, making installation much simpler and more efficient.
If you'd like to get a set of braided lines for your Mark 1, send me a message on Instagram, which I'll put in the description below. So the first thing that we need to do is get these old copper lines removed.
After removing the old lines, I began with the front driver side hose. I carefully fed it into place and tightened it up to the master cylinder. Despite the connector being close to the coolant bowl, there was still a small gap once it was tightened up. Next, I connected it to the hose leading to the caliper and repeated the same steps for the front passenger side. Moving on to the rear, my dad pulled the lines through the hole while I got the grommet in place. Then I temporarily attached the lines to the car using zip ties and secured them to the rear compensator. Although I changed the rear lines, we'll skip showing that process. With the brake system nearly done, all that's left is to install the fluid reservoir and the vacuum line from the intake manifold. The last hose to go on is for the hydraulic clutch, which has a banjo bolt with new copper washers.
At the moment, I've temporarily held in the braided hoses by just using zip ties. The original lines are held in with a piece of rubber, but the braided hoses are too thick to fit in. So I'll order a bigger type which is normally used to hold the fuel lines in, and use them to hold the braided lines instead. So both the clutch and the brakes need bleeding now, and I've got this tool here which should make the job way more easy. The only problem is that this connection only fits on the brake reservoir. So I came up with this. I put a valve stem on a cap which I can then put on the reservoir, put a little bit of pressure, so hopefully I can get all of the air out of the system.
The hydraulic clutch can also use brake fluid, so I filled up the pot accordingly. After screwing on the cap I made, I applied some pressure into the system. Then I cracked open the bleed port and watched as all of the air came out. The next thing that needs filling up is the brake reservoir. Once it was up to the max line, I then screwed on the pressurized bleeder cap and then got the hose connected. Starting with the driver's side rear caliper, as it's the furthest away from the servo, I cracked open the bleeder port and could see the air come out. I repeated this process on all 4 calipers until the fluid ran clear without any bubbles. It's worth noting that the new wheelwood calipers have 2 bleed ports, one for each side piston.
As the brakes are bled now, I thought I'd put the intake back on. As I've gone to do that, I've noticed that the intake is hitting on the brake reservoir. The 2 solutions I've figured out is either I get a custom intake which goes around this way, or just install remote fluid bottles in the rain tray. For now, I'll put the pipe the other way so I can still plug the MAF sensor in. But that isn't the only issue. I've noticed that the shifter weight is hitting on the coolant bottle when I shift into gears. So let's get that sorted out.
By grinding off some metal on the shifter weight that's hitting the coolant bowl, I'm hoping to gain enough room so it doesn't hit anymore. I'm also keeping an eye on how it might affect the shifter's performance. The next item on the agenda is fitting the intake pipe. I've had to turn it around to ensure it fits for the time being. If you have any suggestions for alternative options, or if you can make me one, let me know. After that, I performed a wheel alignment to adjust the steering arms using a piece of string. This method may not be perfect, but it should get the wheels somewhat straight for the initial test drive. wheel was slightly out, so I adjusted the track rod arm until the measurements were nearly equal. Then I tightened up the nut. Following that, I put the makeshift seat in and tested the clutch pedal and brake pedal.
So we're all ready to attempt to drive it. I'm only going to drive it down the street because it doesn't have any doors yet, and I just want to see if the engine and the brakes work fine. So I think everything is where it should be. I'm a little bit nervous, but I think I'm just going to give it a go.
It's crazy to think that the Caddy has been off-road for over 15 years. Now, for the first time since then, it's going on its first drive with a new heart, the 3.2 engine. The heart from the Audi TT lives again and is going to carry on its life in the Caddy. The engine started on the first turn, which was great news. Nervously, I took it out of the driveway, listening for any weird noises, but it all seemed okay. I was slightly worried that the engine sump was going to hit the curb, so I slowly drove out of the driveway. I didn't want any issues on the first drive, plus it was slightly wet outside, so I had to make sure I was careful. As I accelerated a bit, it felt okay. The brakes weren't the sharpest, but I think they need some bedding in. Okay, maybe I got a little bit excited with revving it, but can you blame me? And that's the test drive wrapped up. I decided to end it on a positive note, cutting it short for now. While I'm confident there won't be any issues, I do need to install an exhaust to better gauge the engine's performance. Plus, I wanted to be considerate of the neighbours and avoid any disturbance from the loud exhaust noise.
So there you have it. The engine sounds good, the brake and clutch are working fine. I think that deserves for you to hit that subscribe button. If you've enjoyed watching, don't forget to drop a comment and smash that like button. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.